it was some years ago that you originally invited me to fly over to Australia to give the then address, and I wasn't able to do so. One of the reasons was that something was missing. I had spent 50 years working on the Henry George project, and in the last 20 years, I came to realize that the world was now different to the one that Henry George originally addressed. And we weren't, as Georgist activists, doing something quite right to help the world to change. In other words, I wasn't ready to explain to my friends in Australia how we needed to reframe the narrative in order to advance the cause that Henry George initiated with what was the first global reform movement some 140 years ago. Well, I am now ready to initiate a debate about the way we need to reframe the story that needs to be told. And it's my great honor that I should be doing so before an audience. I understand it's a global one, but particularly to the activists in Australia who've campaigned so assiduously to maintain the gains that were originally achieved some 100 years ago in Australia, but which have been eroded by the vested interests over time. Still, the record of achievement in Australia is seminal, and it's one that the rest of us can learn from and build on. It was 100 years ago that a man called Oswald Spengler wrote a book called The Decline of the West. This is it. I don't know if you can see it. It's just flittering there. The Decline of the West. In it, he analyzed the conditions that led to the collapse of earlier civilizations. He concluded that the decline of those civilizations was spread over 200 years. He identified the conditions that led to the collapse in antiquity and the classical civilizations, and it monitored correctly. You could see the trend, the downward trend over a period of 200 years. He wrote 100 years ago. He said that the beginnings of the decline in the European civilization could be dated to the arrival of Napoleon in France at the beginning of the 19th century, around 1910. He had fought a continental war on behalf of the revolutionary France, and he assumed the authority, Napoleon Bonaparte, and it was from that point on that, in Spengler's view, the 200-year phase of decline in European civilization had begun. Well, he wrote it 100 years ago, and his 200-year period ended in the first 2 decades of this century. Now, in those earlier civilizations, people living through the collapse phase would not have understood that their civilization was on course for collapse. In the case of Rome, the people who had been dispossessed of their land, who had been driven into the towns, were preoccupied with what became known as bread and circuses, which distracted people from the realities of their civilization. It's not easy to come to terms with the idea that our society is actually facing existential collapse. If Oswald Spengler was correct in his analysis, if the conditions that prevailed in Egypt and Mesopotamia and then in Rome and Greece also prevailed in our society, then it would be about now that we would have reached the tipping point, the end of a 200-year phase of decline. It's not surprising that people wouldn't understand what was happening, but we now have the accumulated evidence of the previous civilization's collapse and can see the similarities. Dare I point out one of them? Egypt and Mesopotamia were overrun by a group of people who sailed down from the west along the Mediterranean. Those people are called the boat people. Historians don't know much about the boat people, but they're called the boat people. And they occupied Egypt and Mesopotamian cities, and that was the end of those civilizations. In Rome, the migrants came from the north. The Romans called them barbarians. They took over the land and they sacked Rome. We can't blame the migrants. Those societies had lost the will to survive. The conditions within them had been eroded over such a long period of time that they could not be sustained. And it only took the advent of some existential crisis to cause the fall of those civilizations. So I'm not in the business of blaming migrants. We've all seen the pictures coming out of Afghanistan in the last few days. Hundreds of thousands want to migrate out of that territory into the West. But the process of migration has been coming for a good few years, hasn't it? Europe has been a sustained target for the Middle Eastern migrants and the African migrants. The United States has seen them coming up from the Latin countries. And even at today's comparatively low levels of migration, Europe and North America have not been able to cope with that flow of people. I repeat, I do not blame the migrants. Something has happened within the societies of Europe and North America that makes them vulnerable, unsustainable. And my thesis now, which is a terrible one, is that Western civilization does face collapse. Now, to go public with such a thesis is a risky business because it's easy to dismiss someone making such a claim as somehow a nutcase. It's an awful proposition, and it has to be proven with enormous detail if it's to be taken seriously. Right, now I'm going to begin this narrative by starting with the timetable. The land price cycle does end in 6 or so years, in 2026, and that will be the end of the business cycle in 2028. I've reviewed all the evidence as it might have been affected by the pandemic, which might have distorted the 18-year cycle, and it hasn't done. And as Catherine said earlier, the land market is booming. We are on course for the termination of house prices in 2026 and an economic recession in 2028. But this time we really will be different from the past. Like no other that we personally have experienced in the last 50, 60 years, and nothing like Western civilization has experienced in the last 500 years. My proposition is this: with the collapse of the economy in 2028, we will see the convergence of 4 existential crises, each one a savage event, but the 4 of them brought together at a time when the West is utterly vulnerable economically implies something existential. One of those crises is within the sphere of society at large. I'll pick on one aspect in particular because it's relevant to the incapacity of our society to, as it's now framed, to deal with what is about to happen, and that is political paralysis. We saw in 2008 that one sector, the financial sector, was about to seize up, and all that the politicians could do was say, pour a lot of money into the global economy and that will buy us time. That was not an inspired and imaginative attempt to deal with the causes that created the seizure of the global banking system, but it's all that they could come up with, and there was a stay of execution. This next economic breakdown will mean that the paralysis that we see in politics, in the democracies today, will result in the retreat of governance instead of them trying to imaginatively deal with the tipping points to the various existential crises. So that's a reference to this societal crisis. The next one is the ecological one. I don't think I have to make the case that we are in the throes of climate change, with towns being burnt down by forest fires, being flooded out by rainfalls. And then there are the droughts in Africa, which are causing huge distress. All of these things from across the Arctic, the tundra, down to Australia, we see symptoms. Now, the nations of the world have signed well-meaning global conventions saying they will try and achieve net zero emission output by 2050. But all of the aspirations will take enormous effort, including the expenditure of resources. We've barely begun to spend those resources in order to reduce the output of greenhouse gases and the rest, the dysfunctional behavior that is causing the ecological crisis. Come the economic depression at the end of this decade, there will be even fewer resources, even less capacity to expend the resources on the measures that need to be taken to achieve zero carbon emissions in the housing stock, for instance. Enormous sums of money have to be spent on refitting people's homes, which are one of the major causes of the loss of heat and the emission of carbon into the atmosphere. The transport systems need enormous research and development in order to achieve the 2050 goals the resources will have to be cut back, not added to, in order to solve the problem from the environment. The third existential crisis for Western civilization is the demographic one. The fertility rates in Africa and South America favor young people. Large numbers of young people are even today without hope, without employment prospects, and they're getting on boats, climbing on trains, scrambling in any way they can to get into North America and into Europe. Come the depression that follows the end of the current business cycle, that flow of migrants, of desperate young people, will multiply many times more than what we're seeing today. We're seeing these boats coming across the Mediterranean and then across the English Channel onto the UK beaches. That will accelerate. How will Europe and North America be able to contain the pressures that will arise from that flow? Frankly, there is no prospect of a constructive response to that crisis. We're barely able to cope today with relatively low numbers. But if Africa starts to send them out by the hundreds of thousands, what will then be called the barbarians coming from the south by the right-wing media, we won't be able to cope. And then fourthly, there is the military existential threat. President Biden says democracy is in competition now with the autocracies. Well, the cyber warfare from the autocracies directed at the Western democracies has already begun. They've already interfered in the last presidential election in America and in European elections this past year. When those countries are under severe pressure, they will have one escape route, the autocrats, and that is to distract the discontent at home by intensifying their outward pressures on other countries. The West will be deemed an enemy and needs to be fought. And so we will see the increase in digital warfare in particular. And we all know how it's easy for bad actors to destroy infrastructure in any country. We've already seen that in action by criminals who tie up whole systems, whether it's the British National Health Service or the energy system in America, and demanding huge ransoms to withdraw. The technology is available to destroy a society without firing a gun. So we have these four existential crises reaching a tipping point all at once at precisely the time when Western economies are at their most vulnerable. To me, that means the prospect of the end of Western civilization. That's a grim picture, a terrible picture, harrowing, but somebody has to start expressing it because we need to take action. I lay out the timetable and the existential crises converging on this one point in time in book 2 of #WeAreRent. The first, I'm holding it up, but I don't think you can actually see it. The first book 1 was published some months ago, where I lay out the beginnings of a new narrative. And my argument is that if we are to deal with what is in the offing, we need a new narrative to renew what is the only solution to the crisis that is now striking not just the West, but the whole of humanity. One solution only, and half measures won't do it. Our social galaxy, as I call it, as I called it in book 1 of #WeAreRent, the social galaxy that we humans managed to create is now unsustainable. It lacks the resilience that is needed to keep the systems going. And as I explain in book 1, that resilience, that energy comes from one source only. That source is rent. Human beings evolved out of nature because they were willing to create a net flow of resources over and above what they needed for biological survival and adaptation, as Darwin called it. Those few primates began to produce that additional flow of energy, which they didn't consume, but they invested in themselves biologically, in their minds, mentally, and in their living environment to create a new social galaxy in the universe. And that galaxy was entirely dependent on the continuous flow of rent being invested in the assets that comprised that galaxy. Those assets have now been privatized. I'm saying that in order to save our species, it's as blunt as that. Half measures will not do. The whole of the rents that people generate have to be recycled back into renewing the legacy assets which we inherited from past generations and which we are obliged to convey to future generations. Right now, we're not able to honor that obligation, that existential obligation, which is to convey the past assets to future generations, because we privatized most of it. Well, we need a new start, a new narrative. 140 years ago, Henry George, when he published Progress and Poverty, he was able to resonate with people because most of them were tenants. They didn't own the land because they had been dispossessed. So they had nothing to lose. And when they heard Henry George, he made eminent sense. Today, it's different. Today, in the Western countries, and indeed probably in most nations in the world, most people are owners of land. Small plots underneath their homes, but they identify themselves as landowners. Now, to tell them that we need to re-socialize not the land itself, but the rents of land is awkward. So we need a new narrative that appeals to people's moral sensibilities and a language that begins to make clear that it is incumbent on everybody to begin to reframe the rules on which we conduct our civilization. Now, that's not only going to be tough for the average homeowner, but it imposes a challenge on the Georgist movement itself. And I think I need to emphasize this because, frankly, if we are going to make headway over the next very few years, and we're talking about 6 or 7 years in which to recalibrate the way politics is run in order to prepare for what's going to happen at the end of this decade, the Georgist movement throughout the world will have to play a leading role. But that means, I'm afraid, we need a new language in which to do so. The language that brings forward the moral imperatives on each and every person to re-evaluate the prospects, not just for our generation. Most of us, people like me, might not even be around by the end of this decade. I'm 77. I hope to be here in 2028, but I might not be. But there are a lot of people who will be, and they need to be understanding that the capital gains from their land underneath their homes cannot be preserved if they also want to avoid the worst of what I'm saying is going to happen. So let's look at the basic language that we as Georgists employ to communicate the message of Henry George. Remember, when Henry George advocated a land value tax, he wasn't actually talking about affecting the capital gains of most people, because most people were tenants. They were paying rent and they were not receiving capital gains. Today, most of us are receiving capital gains from land. So why is it that the concept of a land value tax doesn't resonate with people? It did 100 years ago. Remarkable advances were made in Denmark and Australia, for example. There were failures in the UK and in China to offset the gains, but there were measurable gains then because most people weren't landowners. Today, to tell someone we're going to tax land value automatically means that they identify as one of the victims. I own land, I'm a homeowner, I've made capital gains, which I hope to either convey to my children or to fund my retirement time. And now you, Georgist, are threatening to take those gains away from me. So a new way of approaching the conversation is needed. And that's something that we all have to participate in to create the new way of communicating. But I'll start with looking just very briefly at the concept of land value taxation. We're not talking about land, are we? Land value taxation, but hang on. The rent that most of us capitalize in Melbourne or in London is not attributable to the resources of nature. It's attributable to the resources, the services of society. Rent is a binary value. It's composed of the value of nature's resources and society's resources. When we only talk about land, we focus on the physics of the external world, and we forget about, we don't remind people about the fact that we have privatized society and excluded those who do not own a share of those rents. So we need to modify that word land, like the word location. That tells it all. Location is composed of the value of the services that come from both nature and society. Land value. When we say we're going to tax land value, we're telling people you own this land value, you've been in the markets and you've dealt with buying and selling land, and we're going to tax it. Well, that immediately puts people on the defensive. They own the land value. And now I'm wanting to tax your land value. Immediately, the conversation stops. The shutters come down in the mind. We've already shot ourselves, excuse me, in the foot by telling people we're going to tax their land values. We shouldn't be opening up a conversation where we've closed it down before it's even begun. We're talking about rent, an annual flow of resources which we all help to create. The location rents. Nobody owns those. We haven't even produced next year's rents. Nobody has a right to claim the ownership of something that the rest of us have not yet produced. So land value is a problematic phrase itself. And then there's the word taxation. Taxation is, according to the OECD, an arbitrary exaction, and it's a payment for services that are not complementary. There's no synchronicity, no equivalence between how much I pay and the services I receive. In other words, government takes what it deems to be appropriate. There's no symmetry between what I pay and what I get back. Whereas with rent, I decide what the rental value is that I'm willing to pool into the public purse. I negotiate that when I decide where I want to live or where I want to set up my business. I agree the terms and I set how much I can afford to pay for a location. If that sum, that rent is pooled into the public purse, it is utterly symmetrical with the services I expect to receive. I've worked that out for myself. So this is not arbitrary. I decide what I'm pooling, and it's in return precisely for the benefits I expect to get. So now we can rephrase the concept of the land value tax so that it's no longer a tax. It's you and me paying for what we receive. We need this new language to support a new narrative that enables us to go out and tell the world, and I'm literally meaning the world. I don't have the time to embark on the exposition about how we need to elaborate a new narrative for the development world, for instance, Africa and South America. Instead of sending forces into Afghanistan 20 years ago, the West should have been in a position to go to Afghanistan and explain to them the new basis of a renewal of their society, such that we wouldn't have had to have sent in troops to fight terrorists. A new kind of diplomacy would have emerged. Now, that diplomacy doesn't even exist today. We've withdrawn from Afghanistan and left them to their own devices to continue with a system based on violence. That has to change, and it has to change fast, and we need to develop the new kinds of languages that can be deployed in Africa, in Asia, in South America, to forestall what's going to happen at the end of this decade. I'll be addressing that issue in book 3 of #WeAreRent. But for now, I've had to confine myself to looking at how do we recalibrate the democratic system in the West in order to start to regenerate a resilience, a capacity to defend our nations when we reach the end of this business cycle. Book 2 will be available in print next month. That's October. It's later than what I'd expected, but this was my last chance, so I've got to get it right. Those of you who haven't read book 1, and if you're interested in the basis of the new narrative, which is the evolutionary process that led to the creation of Homo sapiens, then I would urge you to get a copy of #WeAreRent Book 1 and read up on the way I've reformulated the evolutionary process, which then begins to get translated into authentic democracy, new international global relationships, and the survival of our species. I think I'll call it quits there, Catherine, and hand it back to you.
Thanks a lot, Fred. Okay, well, next month, We Are Rent 2. I certainly found We Are Rent 1 fascinating. And please, participants, fire your questions into the chat channel there, and we'll start reading them out. But yeah, Fred, you're hinting at the dangers of privatizing society and the importance of a new language and a locational levy. That's the sort of, is that the new buzzword you're going for?
It's a phrase I'm happy that we should all engage in the discussion. It doesn't matter whether we call it a levy, a charge, a royalty. It's just not a tax. Tax turns people off. So I realize that for you guys in Australia, this is awkward. Not awkward for us in Britain because we don't have a land value tax. So that doesn't compromise the discussion from the get-go, whereas you have it institutionalized, but that's where it becomes exciting for people in a country like Australia to begin the conversation with the public by saying, by the way, guys, you're not being taxed. It's actually something quite different, and actually you're underpaying for what you're receiving. Let's embark on a new conversation. And if that takes you through to location levy, fine. If it's more suitable to talk about a location charge or an alternative to the word location, so be it. Remember, the rents of coal are not location. The rents of the radio spectrum is not location, but they all yield rents. So we need a combination of words that capture the full essence of what we need to start collecting to solve all the many problems that we have. But they all track back to that concept of the privatization of rent.
Yes. Okay, so yeah, some people were, I think, a little bit shocked about your discussion of collapse earlier on in the talk. What about the East? How is Asia going to handle this collapse? And you know, you've talked about demographics a lot. Are we still going to have the powerhouse of China pushing the global economy forward?
Well, see, the terrible thing about my thesis is that it isn't confined to the Western democracies. We already see in China, which claims to be communist, the very same processes at work. And the Communist Party today is actually flagging up the dangers of house prices. They don't talk about land prices or location values, but they use the term house prices as a proxy for where the problem is. The big mistake that communist China made 30, 40 years ago was they decided to keep land in public ownership, but they didn't understand that what mattered was not the physics itself, it was the flow of rental income that mattered. And they privatized it by default. So now we see the emergence of new layers of authoritarianism and disorder within China over house prices, the advantages that some people have by educating their kids in private schools, and those schools then capturing land values in their area. Sorry, I should have said location values. And so the very same process that's undermining Western capitalism is also attacking communist China. So they will have a problem come the end of this business cycle, because a large part of the control of the Communist Party is based on being able to produce goods to sell mainly to the West. And if the West starts cutting back on consumption from China, just because out of necessity, the discontent that will emerge within China will be at a level that the Communist Party will struggle to contain. So what does the Communist Party and President Xi do about it? He's already done all he can with Hong Kong. He's smothered that, but he still has his sights on Taiwan. Oh, well, launch the submarines and the landings on Taiwan. That'll distract the discontent of the people back home. That will then involve the United States. And suddenly the digital warfare, the cyber warfare that I was referring to, now becomes a hot war. And so it all plays into this timetable that I am describing, the tipping point of all these existential crises at one point in time. And our world won't be able to cope with it. So as things stand right now, there will be no coping. And that is utterly disastrous. That's why we now have to start coming up with a new kind of narrative that prepares people so that we can start to build the defenses and chart the way out of these tragedies by helping people to renew their communities, their societies, and ultimately the fabric of humanity.
Fred, the questions are coming in thick and fast. Yeah, a lot around cycles, of course. And Bill asks, with COVID going on, if there is a reduction in population between now and 26, and if that reduction is the order of 5 to 20% of the world population, gee, Bill, that's radical, then will the 18-year cycle still continue, or will it bring forward the date?
Nothing is going to change the timetable. Everything that objectively drives this steady increase in land values is in place, and the political system is not capable of amending it. So record low interest rates will be kept low, even if they're raised slightly in response to inflation trends. Easy money through the banks to bolster the economy, to generate capital formation, to create jobs. Everything is focused on sustaining a dysfunctional economy, and all of the gains, or most of them, will end up in land values. There is nowhere else to go. It's the logic of the economic system. So nothing is going to happen between now and 2026 to redirect the course of the 18-year cycle.
How are people going to be able to pay for it, though? We've already got record low interest rates that have sent mortgages skyrocketing. We've got wage rates that are plummeting, along at barely 2% in growth. Are we looking at multi-generational mortgages? How are people going to afford this?
Those opportunities to try and stave off the inevitable and other devices. For example, here in the UK, over the last 10 years, in order for young people to get a footing on the so-called housing ladder, they've stopped having babies. They bought their homes, and the trade-off is the postponement of having a family. That's one device. That's one indicator of the way humanity is being squeezed. A process that began hundreds of years ago, and it's continuing to this day. So, yeah, governments will find short-term measures to bolster the aspirations to become a homeowner, for which read landowner, the buy to own, the first grants to prospective homeowners, all the wonderful terms that they use to try and pour more money, which they're not receiving through the fiscal system. In other words, debt continues to grow, pour it into the economy, ostensibly to help people acquire homes, but which then ends up pushing up the price of land, of locations.
Yeah, it really seems like the perfect storm. And Australia has an ability to increase its immigration levels. Can that be used to help stave off collapse?
We need a whole set of inspirational ideas to deal with what I'm saying is going to happen at the end of this decade. Now, what could they be? The most important is that the West needs to come up with a blueprint for helping the so-called developing countries to rebuild their economies, to give hope to young people. That's the primary strategy. And at the moment, there's no sense of what that blueprint could be. Georgists could develop it. But another strategy would be the sort of thing you're referring to. The land-rich territories could say in advance, when stresses occur, like assuming that people buy into what I'm saying, if countries are in terrible crisis, like in Afghanistan, then they can be resettled in land-rich areas. That includes South America. It includes Australia. The fact of the existence of such planning done under controlled conditions, measured behavior, so that the host countries are not put under terrible strain, would contribute to the hope that people will need when things start to go badly wrong in 2026, 2027, 2028, and beyond.
Based on previous cycles and campaigns, what arguments for a transition to land value tax resonated and got the most traction with MPs, policymakers, and the general public? Ask Matt.
Well, I don't think that it was the onset of the end of an 18-year cycle that then inspired people to take sensible action. If we look at the histories of countries that did apply the sensible fiscal reform, like Australia, like Denmark, like Taiwan, these were done for historically unique reasons, not related to the trends in the land cycle. So we're not going to learn too much looking at the connection between the end of an 18-year cycle and the onset of sensible fiscal reform. We do need to look at the historical examples in order to understand why people did indeed either adopt the beginnings of the correct form of public finance and why they began to abandon them. And I'll feature some of those in book 2 of #WeAreRent, and also in particular in book 3, which is the global survey of the problems that I'm raising today. History has a lot to teach us, but in the end, it will come down to the moral question. The moral question that people can talk about in the pub between each other. When one person says, you're going to confiscate my capital gains, what I worked hard for, you have to be able to respond in the kind of language that lets that person know that he's wrong and that he must take action as part of a global movement to begin to reorientate. There needs to be a transition period. We can't just overnight change the system. I'll allude to the sorts of transitional strategies in book 2, but we need far more detail discussion of how that transition can be effected to reassure people, particularly, well, there are 2 groups, aren't there? The young people who have just bought a home and who think they're going to get rich by sitting on that property. And here we are telling them that they're not going to get rich. And then there are the elderly people who are relying on the accumulated capital gains, and they have to be reassured that they're not going to get abandoned if they support this transition to a sane kind of public finance. So that transitional period has to be defined in considerable detail with care to reassure people that there are no losers in what's got to be done. In fact, everybody contributes to the renewal, not just to their community, their neighbors, not just to their nation even, but actually the renewal of what I ultimately call the social galaxy, this home that we live in, that's in the universe, that's unique, but which could be expunged from the universe in no amount of time. Think how soon, how quickly Egypt collapsed as a civilization. And all that happened was some boat people came along from the west along the Mediterranean. They landed on the shores, and this ancient Egyptian civilization collapsed. And cities in Mesopotamia that flourished and then suddenly collapsed. Rome collapsed in a matter of days. But no, it wasn't days. It was at least over a period of 200 years. And those 200 years were foreshadowed by something. And as I seek to explain it, it was one thing and one thing only that caused the collapse. And that was the diversion of the energy away from the way it should have been invested, that is in the well-being of everybody in our social galaxy, and diverting it to the self-centered preoccupations of the first free riders, as they're known, the rent seekers. And now we're all rent seekers, and that's got to change, or we pay a very, very heavy price. And this, in other words, folk, this is unique in human history. It couldn't have happened earlier. The collapse of one civilization still left territories elsewhere for human beings to develop and flourish and create a new civilization. We are today one global civilization. We all stand and fall together, and we have to renew that narrative, the one that reaches out to human beings on the basis that we're all in this mothership or social galaxy, as I call it, together. We sink or swim together.
In a collapse, alternatives are sought, writes Michael, and over 50% of young people currently view socialism as a preferred alternative. On another extreme, we have more and more conspiracies coming through, and this great reset argument through the World Economic Forum that people have really jumped to. What reflection does that have on society's changing values, their barometer for common sense?
These are issues that we have to address. We can't dodge them, and they are symptomatic of the state of our world today. I attempt to argue in book 2 that our world is actually insane. And I define it rigorously. I don't use it as a hyperbolic language. Clinically, our world is insane. And therefore, people behave in an insane and mentally deranged way. So out of that, you would expect the conspiracy theories and the rest of it. And they have to be addressed because they are symptomatic of the loss of control that human beings needed in the past if they were to evolve out of nature in a controlled way. We've lost control. So some of the symptoms are, Carl, as you described it, and we have to address those people. Look, take the case of our friend who was the last president, Mr. Trump. It wasn't some kind of aberration that he got elected. Trump is the arch rent seeker. He managed to delude millions of people who were the very people that his culture, the rent-seeking culture, ripped off. He managed to use the media and the state of derangement in people's minds to persuade them that he was actually going to make America great again. He was going to increase their welfare, their jobs, their take-home pay. But actually, his mission was to do quite the reverse. As a rent seeker, he was plundering the system. So there is an example of insanity in action on this huge scale, that America, who didn't need Donald Trump, elected him, and 74 million tried to get him re-elected. It's this form of insanity that has to be explained in clinical terms so that people, when they are having a cup of coffee with their mates at home in the mornings or in the pub in the evening over a pint, come to understand that there is something fundamentally wrong in our society, and that it all does track back to a common cause. And therefore, there is only one remedy. And that's when the conversation becomes fruitful. That's when we can have hope that we can get through what is now going to happen.
It's been refreshing how many people have recognized there's a major problem with our economic system following the global financial crisis. But the rise of the UBI movement, where does that have a place in this new narrative? Asks Paul Ross. Is it an important place to eradicate indirect slavery, or a peripheral one?
Oh, you've put me in a spot. I emphasized that in the transition, we have to make sure that there are no losers. We have to protect people's welfare, empower them to participate in the renewal of their communities, that is, from their neighborhoods through their towns to their national systems and globally even. But what do we get from the proposal of a universal basic income? I have to say that a UBI, as it's now being promoted, is one of those utopian escapisms which seeks to avoid the harsh reality. The advocacy of a universal basic income says this: there is a fundamental problem. Many people are impoverished. There are millions of paupers in the world, oh, well, never mind. Let's not solve the problem why this is so. Let's just give everybody a basic income that they can live on. We don't have the money to give it to them, but let's give it to them anyway. And let's just print the money, shall we, if we've got the capacity to do so. And that will solve the problem of poverty. Well, no, it won't, because all the while, the very problem that creates poverty is working away. So think about what the house price, the rent of low-income homes will be if everybody was now granted a universal basic income. Low rent houses will go up in rents. The landlords will say, oh, well, you're getting a universal basic income and you can go to work and earn a little extra on top. I'm going to put my rent up. So where has that left the poverty-stricken people who thought they were going to be elevated out of poverty by this UBI? I regret to say that universal basic income, like modern monetary theory, are exercises in avoiding the harsh realities, not coming to terms with the causes, but trying to imagine painless ways to get around those problems. And in the end, we will all pay the price if we keep going with those ideas.
Do you think, though, that UBI and MMT could slot in with LVT as part of a new economic paradigm? Is Guy Standing, one of the prominent UBI advocates, is promoting LVT and monopoly rent taxes more often? How do you see that, those combinations working together?
Well, Guy Standing does tuck away the proposal that there should be a land value tax at the back of his proposal. So you could say he merges the two. I would continue to argue that we need to protect everybody in the transition. That doesn't have to be a UBI. Why do billionaires and millionaires need a UBI? If the resources are short, if governments are desperate, why give everybody a universal basic income? Everybody needs to be protected. That includes billionaires who worked for their wealth and who should not be targeted as if they hadn't earned their wealth. We need a sophisticated way of presenting the case for re-engineering the economy. That does mean protecting low-income people, making provisions for them. But why does that have to include giving money to billionaires? I just don't see it.
Okay. A few people have asked questions about an LVT. What percentage of taxes could it replace? Can a location levy be deducted against existing income taxes? How would that transition play out? And how significant are these monopoly rents compared to what we're being told about in the economic textbooks?
This is where the language comes in. We're not, or at least I'm not saying that there's any percentage rate that needs to be applied. All I'm saying is this: if you want this set of public services and the services of nature in the location where you live, they're worth a certain rent, and you pool that rent into the public purse. There's no tax, there's no percentage rate. The rent that you ascribe to the value of the location, which you're willing and able to pay, is what goes into the public purse. No more, no less, which means there's no capital value left, of course, to sell to anybody else. And that's where people become anxious, because they're thinking, oh gosh, I lose my capital value in the location where my house exists. But we need to start scrapping all the bad taxes. So if this is a revenue neutral rebalancing, if you're a worker, the taxes taken from your wages start to come down. If that means you've got to start paying more rent into the public purse, this is a neutral process. At some point, some people will find they're paying more into the public purse than they're receiving in tax returns by cancelling the tax take from their incomes. If they are hardship cases, they need to be dealt with. The usual sob cases of the capital rich, income poor widow needs to be addressed. Care needs to be devoted to the people who need support in the transition. But there is no compromise of rates of taking. If you want it, you pay for it. And you're already doing so anyway when you say that declare how much you will pay to locate your home in a given location. You're already paying that sum. You're just not paying it to the right people. And so the discussion needs to be simplified in a way that reasonably minded people will say, well, that makes sense. So we don't need complex equations about tax takes and deals and all the rest of it. So just a revenue neutral rebalancing, protecting the people who are vulnerable, and establishing a sustainable system where everybody gets the right to work and earn their living. And in doing so, they generate a net income, a rent, which they pool for the common good of humanity.
About those people who are locked out of property, how can they understand this story? And, you know, the communication from the ground up you keep talking about, but you know, I kind of feel like even a locational levy, that sort of terminology is hard. It's a question of the ages, this one, isn't it? We've all Georges have tried to crack this one, and it's not easy.
Okay, so on the politicians, the House of Commons here in Britain, hundreds of members of Parliament are landlords. So, of course, they're vested in the current system. How do we access the minds of ordinary people? Well, that's where changing the language, it becomes important. So is it tough to engage them in a conversation? No, it isn't. They know that governments are not able to fund public services. They will say, yeah, that's right. So now we say, well, that's because you and me and everybody else are not actually paying for those services. They then say, well, hang on, I pay taxes. Now the conversation is going, yes, you're paying taxes, but that actually disrupts the economy. You're paying a rent, but you're paying the rent to the wrong people. You're not paying it for the services that you receive. You're paying it to somebody else, a third party. Oh, what do you mean? Well, then you can illustrate that. You chose to live here because of the availability of fast transport systems into the center of town. But there are all the potholes, the trains don't run on time, and there's all kinds of problems because the government's not funding that system. Why is that? It's because they don't have the money. But you paid for those services, so why haven't they got the money? Because the money that you paid to have access to the transit system didn't go to the transit system, it went to a third party. So now we've got this roundabout maniacal system of finance where public services are not funded properly. Well, that's a conversation that ordinary people can engage in because they will then start to ask the relevant questions. They will say, but if I'm paying for them, why is it that the government isn't getting the money? Oh, I see, you mean I paid it to a third party who doesn't provide the transit system. Well, why did I do that? And so the conversation proceeds from there. And the word location is not difficult to grasp with. The idea of a charge, a fee. Look, when we go into a supermarket, we pay for the services we receive. And that's what we're talking about. People understand that. And that's all we're asking for. All we're asking is that you pay for what you receive. And the conversation proceeds from there.
Very good. Tony Gradden asks, has capitalism become landlordism?
Capitalism is a misnomer. It's not capital, it's landism. The problem with our system, well, Marx wanted us to focus on capital, which is his bad contribution to our collective mindset. It is landism, isn't it? That's where the problem is. The privatization of rent and all the problems, the serious social problems emanate from that one fact, the privatization of rent. And that predated the period that is usually called capitalism, which is associated with industrialization, which is like a couple of 100 years. This pathological system predated the onset of capital-based industrial society. And so from the beginnings of it, and we're talking in contemporary terms, 500 years ago, in the 16th century, it's been downhill all the way as more and more. Go on.
Keep going.
As more and more of the rents that are captured and privatized, so the potential, the resilience of our society, our culture, our capacity as human beings has been on decline. And we've reached what I call the cannibalistic point. We've eaten up the assets that human beings would ordinarily be investing in, and there's nowhere to go. And yet we're talking about half of national income. And this is one issue that Australia is very important about. And the projections of national income as divided 50 or so percent as rent, illustrated by Brian Kavanagh's graphs and so on, is really important to help ordinary folk understand that we're talking about the half of national income. So when economists say, oh, but there's not enough revenue to have a single tax, which you read today in their textbooks, the answer is rubbish. You, the economic professor who was awarded a Nobel Prize, are talking rubbish. And then we have to explain that, and we do it with graphics, including those from Australia. I'm now wandering off the question, sorry.
Oh, you're allowed to rant for sure. That's from the Trickle Up Economics report we're talking about there. Gavin Putland, who's on the call today, did some fantastic work there. Look, we're coming towards the conclusion here. Couple more questions.
Fire away.
Carl, Joe Siegel here. Can you hear me?
Go, coming through clear.
Hi, Carl. Hi, Fred. I was in a chat room with James, and we just quickly drew some issues that would be helpful. We recognise that the whole program is a marketing exercise, and to work within the system, you need vision, leadership, lobbying probably at very, very high levels, but also to create a vision for the outcomes and how the disposition of funds would be used to give people some comfort. Can I just add one thing? The compelling nature of Noah's Ark story is probably quite relevant. As he was building the boat, everyone dismissed the foreboding floods, only to find that when the event occurred, everyone clamoured to jump on board. So it's an apocalyptic type situation, and that may have an analogy in it to build a case. Thank you.
Yeah, really important that we inspire people's imaginations with what will follow. And that's going to be easier than it might have been 5 or 10 years ago, because almost every night we watch the television news and we see wildfires burning towns down in California. We see whole cities being flooded. We see thousands upon thousands migrating out of drought-ridden areas. So half the job that we have to do is already on the TV screens. We now have to present the flip side of that by opening up the visions of how changing the fiscal system is the beginnings of renewal. How would it renew? How would neighborhoods become stronger? How would relationships change? How would mental health alter? How would access to homes at affordable rates become the norm? These are all things that would happen. And we do need the inspirational messages to go out in the form of speeches, YouTube videos, articles. Yes, you're right. It's a marketing job, but it's one that has to be participative. We need people to join in. So there need to be public meetings where people engage in the discussions, and the whole thing would take off. If I could end, there's one more question, but may I please add the following? I am convinced that once we get this narrative going, the people with the resources, the financial resources to fund the projects that need to be undertaken will come forward. It's a blind act of faith on my part. There is some basis for that sense of what will happen. So it's not just pure fantasy on my part. I believe once we get the ball rolling, the money will come forward. The people will step forward. So we ought to be optimistic and just put in the initial groundwork. And I do admit that that does place a burden on you guys in Melbourne, where you have the capacity to start some things happening.